Well, hello everybody, welcome back if you've visited my channel before, and welcome if you haven't. It's turning to that sort of time of year when, I don't know why, I always seem to want to read some historical fiction, and I started trawling through my shelves, and within minutes 5 books had leapt out at me, some of which I'd sort of semi-forgotten I'd read, but all of which had a huge impact on me as I read them. I love historical fiction. I think it's probably my favourite genre. And there's something about this time of year where very often these books are perhaps a little bit more lengthy than a lot of contemporary novels. Although, having said that, most of these are relatively contemporary novels. I think it's the genre. I think there's something about historical fiction that writers, you know, they've done a lot of research, and I suspect they want to really sort of delve into their subject matter and explore it thoroughly. So without further ado, I'll talk about the first book that I picked. And actually, this goes against the grain of what I've just said because it's not that lengthy a novel. It's called Tulip Fever by Deborah Moggach. Never sure how to pronounce it. But she's an author who I wouldn't normally associate necessarily with historical fiction, and I read this relatively recently. I picked it up at a charity shop, and I love tulips, and I did know a little bit about the Dutch fascination for tulips in the 1700s, and the way that had, you know, if you go to any sort of art galleries in places like Amsterdam or well, all over the world, and you go into rooms of 17th century art, you'll see lots and lots of still lives which feature tulips, and this was because of the huge trend for them at the time. And this novel is wonderful in capturing that period and the febrile nature of those people who were so in pursuit of finding the perfect bulb, the best bulb. I mean, some of these bulbs, even at the time, fetched thousands of pounds, because everybody was after, you know, the next novelty. So I suppose in some ways it's an exploration of fashion, and also kind of the lunacy of fashion, and the idea that, you know, the desire to have something really exclusive. But anyway, the story's told through 2 narrators. There's Sophie, who I assume is kind of pictured here, and then, or is she Sophia? I can't quite remember. And her husband Cornelis. And I fell in love with Sophia's narration right from the beginning, because she describes her husband. You're watching him eat through her eyes, and he is utterly repellent. He's a lot older than her, you know, as many young women would be married at the time, wouldn't they, to much older men. And you know, there's no love lost in this marriage. And she really is, in many ways, you know, just another acquisition of, you know, of his wealth. Anyway, Cornelius decides that, you know, in order to sort of, as testament to how wealthy he is, he'll have a marriage portrait painted of him and his wife and lots of their possessions. And a young painter comes along, and guess what? He and Sophia fall in love, and it's the story of their experience. It has the pace of a thriller. You know, it's very, very readable. It's a really driven narrative, but it's set in all this fantastic world of Amsterdam, and as I say, all this bartering for flowers, and lots of sort of almost like chase scenes. You know, you're sort of wandering through the back streets of Amsterdam with the characters, and you know, I can't recommend it highly enough. As I say, for this time of year, it's a really lovely book to curl up and read. And then next up, I tried to do these as I picked them out. I tried to do these in sort of roughly chronological order. I realised most of them actually are Victorian, or at least set in the Victorian era, set in the 19th century. This one I absolutely adored. I don't know if you can see it because it's got a lovely gleam on it. It's beautiful cover, and it's got these lovely sort of, I don't know what the technical term is, but these like chevuxty kind of edges. They're not spreaders because they're not sprayed, I don't think. They could be, I don't know. Anyway, The Good People by Hannah Kent. I read her previous book, Burial Rites, which I absolutely loved, so that was what drew me to this. And this is a story that begins in the, I think it's set in the 1820s, so sort of earlier in the 19th century. And it's set in rural Ireland, and it centres around a little boy who originally, seemed like a perfectly healthy child, and then when the novel opens, he can't speak, he can't walk, and the local inhabitants think that he's possibly a changeling because there's this whole run of sort of really bad luck that descends on the village. So he started to be treated with real sort of suspicion, as is anybody connected with him. So the story, he's kind of the the catalyst for the story. But then there are these three fantastic women who take an interest in him for various different reasons. One's his grandma, who's just been widowed, and she obviously is helping to bring him up. There's the wonderful character of Nance, who is a woman who she understands herbs and plants, and people come to her if there's problems with their health or whatever. So you've got these three very strong, there's also Mary, these three very strong women who are trying to protect this young child. And then you've got a new priest who arrives, and there's a lot of the tensions obviously mount, and particularly between him and Nance. And I love this book because it's one of those novels. It's based on true sort of historical facts, in inverted commas. So Hannah Kent's tried to recreate that experience that these inhabitants of the village had in the 1820s. But it reads like folklore. There's a real sort of mythical, almost dreamlike quality to it. And in many ways, it doesn't seem like the 1820s. When you read the novel, you could be forgiven for thinking that it was hundreds and hundreds of years older than that, because of course, in these rural communities, time doesn't really change particularly. So lots and lots and lots of fascination for this, beautifully written. And I think, I absolutely loved The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargreave. And I think this novel sort of centres around some quite similar themes. So I think if anyone who's read that and enjoyed it and hasn't read this book may well really, really enjoy diving into it. And next up is a novel called Kalimantan by CS Godshalk. Now, she was living in Southeast Asia when she wrote this novel. And again, obviously I'm talking about it because I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's the story of a young man who called Gideon Barr, who settles in Borneo, which is now, I think, Sarawak in Malaysia, and it's during the time of the Raj, and he basically dominates the community. He drives out some of the indigenous people. He imposes his authority and rule over those indigenous people. And the novel kind of centres around his acquisition of a wife. He goes back to England to find himself an English bride, and brings her back to Kalimantan with him. And the reason I loved this novel so much was because it's largely told, I suppose, from her perspective, from the young wife's, and you're seeing things very often through her eyes, and it shows the kind of how frightening and strange and peculiar and uncomfortable colonial life would be for a young woman who's kind of dragged into that situation. And I thought that was really interesting. You know, it affects her health, it affects her mental state. A lot of the novel is sort of related in this quite dreamlike sort of quality. You drift in and out of things, and sometimes you're not quite sure whose perspective you're seeing things from. But I think that kind of tropical heat, you know, if you're dressed in crinoline and you're trying to sort of uphold the mores of the empire, then it is going to be, you know, it is going to mess with your mind. There's a lot of brutality in this novel as well. It doesn't remotely sort of hang back from the brutality of the indigenous populations, but also, of course, the terrible brutality of the British in the way that they sort of suppress and control that. It's tense. It's packed full of characters, and I know some people might find that quite off-putting, because you've got characters drifting in and out and reappearing, and you know, it can mess with your head. It's a book really to be read not quite in one go, but I wouldn't want to eke it out over weeks, because I think you get a little bit lost. But I just think it works really hard to try and capture a particular moment in the history of Malaysia, and I think it does it, you know, in a as honest a way as she possibly can. It is based on the true story, on a true story. I think it probably takes quite a lot of liberties with that story, but certainly there is an element of historical accuracy behind it as well. So yeah, well worth a read if you want to be in a suffocating tropical environment in the depths of winter. This is probably where you need to go. Next up, I know this was a novel that called The Glass Palace by Amitav Ghosh, who's an Indian writer writing in English, and this was I think quite a bestseller at the time. I think it came out probably in I want to say about 1990s, something like that. I could be wrong. And this book, rather than sort of focusing like the previous one on quite a short interval in history, this is a novel that spans probably at least 100 years, and it focuses on it's in some ways you could describe it perhaps as a family saga. It's not quite that, but the lead character is you meet him first as a young boy running through the streets of Mandalay, and I've forgotten his name. That's awful. I can't remember his name. What's he called? I haven't got my glasses on either. Raj Kumar. He's called Raj Kumar. And he's this young lad, and he's really enterprising, and it's at there's an Anglo Burmese war which breaks out, and every day he can see this glass palace, you know, and he runs past this glass palace, and because of the war, the Burmese are allowed to go in and actually, you know, observe the royal family, and he sees this young girl called Dolly, who's a lady in waiting to the Burmese princess, and just falls for her. So in some ways it's a love story, but you watch his sort of career develop over decades, and he hooks up at one point with a teak merchant, and he learns, you know, the timber trade, and he has this ambition to build his own, to have his own tea company, and he manages to achieve that. But of course, his life is continuously disrupted by the downfall of the British Empire, by by war, by all sorts of chaos, basically. And so the novel spans, it focuses on Burma, it focuses on Malaya, so there's a connection with the previous novel, and it also focuses on some aspects of Indian history as well. And eventually, Raj Kumar gets tangled up in the rubber trade as well. And it's a really interesting exploration of the impact of the meltdown of the British Empire, but also the impact of the war, the Second World War as well, because that's covered. And I just loved it. You drift to all these different wonderful exotic places that you might never get a chance to visit in real life, and you learn about, I think that's what I love about historical fiction, is that, it's sort of like time travel, isn't it? That idea of going back and being a fly on the wall with these people. And Dolly's story is really interesting as well, because she goes from being this lady in waiting, and the Burmese royal family are exiled essentially by the British, and she goes with them, and of course he then has this quest to try and find her. So you've got all sorts of really nice kind of very ancient storytelling tropes and threads, but equally you've got this lovely expose of the historical period. So I really recommend this. I've only read one other of his books. I read a book called Sea of Poppies, which is about the opium trade, which I really enjoyed as well. I think there are more, and I think it's about time I read another one. And finally, Emma Donoghue's book. Now, Emma Donoghue is an Irish writer. I think maybe she's Irish Canadian. I think she might live in Canada now. And she wrote. She's very well known for the novel Room, which also became a hit film. But I love her writing. I've read quite a few of her books. I love her short stories as well. And this novel, The Sealed Letter, I just found it extraordinary. I don't think I'd ever quite read anything like it before. Now, this is sort of the tail end of the 19th century now. And this is a novel really about friendship and betrayal. Because it starts with Fido, who's this very sort of, she's thrown her hand in with the women's rights movement. She has used some inherited wealth to set up a printing press so that they can print pamphlets and things like this. So she's quite a, forward-thinking woman. And it's very interesting watching her struggles with her family and the people around her. And also learning about characters who promote and support her as well, male characters particularly. I found that fascinating. But anyway, Fido bumps into an old friend of hers who she hasn't seen for years and years and years, called Helen. And they sort of re-establish the friendship. But right from the beginning, you kind of feel like you can't quite understand why these two women were ever friends, really, because Helen's got this, I remember at the beginning she's described as wearing this acid yellow dress, and immediately you're like, ooh, who would wear one of those? I'm not suggesting, I love a bit of yellow myself, but, for the time, I think it would have been a little bit, out there. And so she wears this dress, and she's quite flighty, and anyway, they pick up the friendship, and basically Fido becomes instrumental in facilitating Helen's opportunity to conduct an affair with a young military officer, and it doesn't go well. And it's so tense, this novel, in many ways. It's a courtroom drama. There's a court case which is brought about by Helen's husband. He's a really interesting character as well. It's a book where your sympathies shift and change. And I think, I don't see this book out and about much. You know, I don't see it on bookshelves and things in bookshops. And yet I think it's a really, if you love historical fiction, I think you really enjoy this novel. So there we are. They are my historical fiction 5 for the tail end of October. And, you know, books hopefully to snuggle up with and enjoy and time travel with as the onset of winter, certainly in this neck of the woods, approaches. Okay, take care. Really lovely to ramble on. Bye.